There were no tears at funerals in Drem Valley, not because grief did not exist, but because sorrow had a sound, and sound had a way of summoning things best left asleep. That morning, the mist came early. A cold, milky fog clung to the treetops like cobwebs spun from ash. The skeletal silhouettes of pine trees loomed across the slopes, sharp and crooked like broken fingers reaching skyward. The sun, if it rose at all, never reached the forest floor. A procession moved quietly down the red clay path. 12 villagers clad in coarse gray cloth, heads bowed, hands wrapped in linen. They carried a bier of woven birch and twine, upon which lay the body of a man named Olven. He had been a hunter, skilled and silent, until the forest claimed him with a venomous mushroom the color of rusted teeth. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. No one spoke, no one dared hum a hymn. The only sound came from a crude bamboo cage resting beside the corpse. Inside, a black crow fluttered restlessly, as if sensing what was to come. The elders walked ahead. At the front, the village headman bore the bone blade, a knife carved from the spine of a mute priest long dead. Beside him, the voiceless cleric shuffled forward, his face shriveled like bark, eyes milky and hollow. No one had heard him speak in 40 years. They said if he ever uttered a single word, the dead would remember they were forgotten. They reached the burial grove by noon. There were no stones here, no names, just earth, moss, and the silence of 1,000 hushed regrets. They laid Olven's body onto the dirt, and the ritual began. The bone blade gleamed dull in the pale light. With practiced hands, the headman opened the dead man's mouth. The crow cawed once, sharply. Then with one swift motion, they removed the tongue. Still warm, still pink, still capable of song. It was dropped into the cage. The crow shrieked and then devoured it whole. Thus began the passage to peace. In Drem, the dead were silenced before they were buried. Their tongues were offerings to the birds, to the wind, to the sky, so that whatever regrets lingered in the flesh could never find a voice. A dead man who remembered too much could weep through the soil, whisper through wood, sing into the ears of children. And if the dead ever sang, they would never stop. The grave was sealed without a prayer, just the thud of dirt, the rustle of old leaves. When it was done, the villagers turned and walked away, feet quiet against the moss-covered path. But Elna stayed. She stood at the edge of the grave, her shawl tight around trembling shoulders. Her eyes did not blink, her lips did not move. Olven had been her brother, the last of her blood, and she could not understand how a man who once sang lullabies to the wind would now rot without a voice beneath the earth. That night, she would dream of mouths without faces and crows with too many tongues. Elna did not return to her hut that evening. Instead, she sat beside the grave until the mist thickened and the trees became shadows of shadows. Her shawl soaked through with dew. Her breath came in slow, trembling loops, each one clouding the air like a sigh from the soil. Behind her, the village lights flickered dimly, yellow glows behind shuttered windows, the silence of a people trained not to listen too closely. She could still hear it. the sound that should not exist. It was faint, like the echo of a lullaby hummed through water. The melody was familiar, too familiar. It was Olven's voice. Of course, that was impossible. His tongue had been taken, his mouth sewn shut with a ritual thread of horsehair and ash. And yet, she heard it. No words, just longing stretched into sound. It came from below. The dirt seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, as if something deep inside was not sleeping, but stirring, like breath pressing against its cage. Elna rose, stumbling slightly. Her knees ached, her fingers were numb, but her resolve was clear. She would not let this happen again. In Drame, there was one unspoken rule, more sacred than all others. No burial without silence. A corpse must be cleansed before entering the earth, its tongue fed to a crow, its mouth sealed, its name not spoken again for 1 year and 1 day. Elna had followed this ritual for every member of her family, her father, her mother, her child, but she would not do it to Chiron. He was not born in Drame. He had come from the mountains, an outsider with frost in his beard and stories in his voice. He sang to the trees, hummed while cooking, spoke names with tenderness. Elna had fallen in love not just with the man, but with the sound of him. And when the forest took him, something inside her broke. She could not let them silence him, so she buried him in secret. 3 nights before Olven's funeral, while the village slept beneath the blood moon, Elna stole Chiron's body from the cold hut where it had been laid for cleansing. She carried him herself through the pinewood paths, past the ancient oak known as the listening tree. She dug with her bare hands until her nails split. No crow, no knife, no fire thread. Just a grave, just love. She whispered into his ear before the final scoop of dirt. You don't have to forget me. If your soul sings, let it sing. Now, as she walked home under a sky scraped raw by the wind, the weight of that choice pressed against her bones. Because tonight, in the hearts of the trees, she heard more than just Chiron's voice. She heard others. Soft, discordant, wet, like teeth clacking on wet stone, like breathless moans trying to remember words they no longer had the tongues to form. And when she stepped across her threshold, something was waiting. On her kitchen table lay a dead crow. Its wings were broken, its neck twisted backward, and gripped in its claws was a tongue, fresh, human, still twitching. Not Chiron's. Someone else had started to remember, too. The tongue was gone by morning. Elna had fallen asleep sitting upright in her chair, the dead crow still sprawled across her kitchen table, its feathers damp with dew. But when she awoke, heart thumping, skin cold with sweat, the tongue that had once twitched like a dying worm was no longer there. Only a dark smear remained, a trail almost, like it had crawled away. She didn't scream, not because she wasn't afraid, but because, in Drame, screaming was a dangerous thing. Sound traveled too far here. The wind was known to carry voices into cracks where they didn't belong, into graves, into bones. And what listened on the other side never stopped listening. By midday, strange things had begun happening. It started with the children. They were playing near the old mill, 5 of them gathered by the shallow stream where the wheels no longer turned. Laughter echoed against the rocks, shrill and playful. until it stopped all at once. One by one, the children began humming. Not just any tune, the same tune. It was a slow, looping melody, soft as breath, eerie as fog through bare branches, a song no one had taught them, a song they had no words for, only instinct. And they all hummed in perfect harmony. When their parents rushed to gather them, 2 of the children were found with blood trickling from their ears. By evening, the village healer would be dead, his body discovered in his hut, hunched over a broken violin, ears split open like overripe fruit. In his throat was something long and thin, a splinter of bone, as if something had tried to play him. Elna stayed indoors. She locked every door and window, hung salt cords across the frames, lit the old cedar candle her grandmother had once told her, quote, keeps things from hearing too much, end quote. But nothing could quiet the sound beneath her floorboards. The humming had come home. Soft at first, barely a vibration, like a heartbeat in the walls, then stronger, rising with the wind, matching its rhythm. A choir with no mouths, no lungs, just bone and memory. Elna sat by the fireplace, clutching the iron poker in her lap like a sword, even though she knew there was nothing to fight, not in the ordinary sense. This wasn't a haunting, it wasn't a ghost, it was a reminder. And reminders don't knock, they return. They rot upward. Just before midnight, the humming shifted. It gained words. Not in any language Elna recognized, but in shape, in pain, in breath. The sound pressed behind her ears, vibrating through her skull like teeth grinding in stone. She ran to the floorboards, fell to her knees, pressed her ear against the wood. Silence. And then, suddenly, music. A deep, moaning chord like the dragging of a cello bow across ribs. Beneath it, a whisper. You left me whole, but they were never whole. Elna jerked back. Something knocked once from below. Then again, then again. A rhythm, a beat, a bone choir tuning itself. Elna didn't sleep that night. She sat in the corner of her cottage, back pressed to the stone wall, knees drawn to her chest, a knife clutched in her hand, though she knew it was useless. You can't stab sound. You can't silence what has already been buried with a name. Outside, Drem was wrapped in fog so thick it seemed to choke the sky itself. The forest had gone unnaturally still. No rustling, no insects, no wind. Only the faint hum that now never fully stopped. It was always there, beneath the silence, behind the teeth. A melody waiting for a mouth. By dawn, the first villager had gone missing. His name was Wern, a woodcutter who lived alone near the border trees. He was known for his strength, his temper, and his loud voice. People whispered he cursed the ritual when his wife died the year prior, refused to cut her tongue, claimed it was barbaric. They found his door wide open, his boots still on the step, his bed unslept in, and on his kitchen table, a single human tongue. Fresh, red, still wet. It was laid carefully atop a folded napkin. Next to it, a small bundle of crow feathers bound in black thread. A symbol, a warning, a signature. But it wasn't Wern's tongue, because his tongue was nailed to the ceiling. Panic began to ripple through Drem, though no one dared raise their voice. They had been taught since birth to bury fear in silence. To scream was to tempt what listened beneath the roots. Instead, the villagers gathered in the square, whispering prayers through stitched lips, asking the elders what they had done wrong. But the elders had no answers. The priest had not spoken in 4 decades. His lips were still sewn, his eyes growing increasingly white with something that looked like mold. He stood in the center of the crowd, trembling slightly, pointing toward the widow's house, at Elna. They had begun to suspect. They always did. Elna did not wait for them to come. She knew what they would ask. She had seen this before. The soft, unspoken hysteria that built in Drem like mold in damp corners. When logic failed, the village reached for tradition like a blind man reaching for a knife. She packed a small satchel, salt, thread, a candle blackened with soot, the old deer-bone whistle her mother gave her, the one meant to summon protection, though it never worked, and she followed the trail. There had been markings in the dirt outside her home that morning. Thin lines, curved, twisting, as if someone had crawled from beneath the house, dragging something heavy behind them. The trail led east, past the old bridge, into the thicket where the children were no longer allowed to play. And then she saw it, a tree with no bark, carved bare, its trunk split open like a wound, and from its hollow core, something wet and pink dangled like fruit. A tongue. The same one that had vanished from her table. But now, it was moving. Not twitching, humming. Elna stepped closer, against every instinct. Her fingers trembled, but her feet obeyed something deeper. A pull, a familiarity. The tongue was singing. Not in words, in memory. She recognized the tune. It was the song Kairon used to hum to her in bed when the winter wind rattled the window panes and she couldn't sleep. He had no voice now, but his regret did, and it had begun to infect the others. As she reached out, something snapped behind her. A stick? A footfall? She turned, but nothing was there. Then the tree behind her let out a low creak. She spun again, and now the tongue was gone. Only the echo of the melody remained, and something new. Footprints, leading deeper into the woods. And beside them, in a neat little line, 4 more tongues, each from a different person, each still singing. By the time Elna returned to the village, her boots were soaked with mud and old blood. Her satchel was heavier. She had wrapped the 4 tongues in strips of cloth and sealed them in a jar of ash and salt, like her grandmother once taught her when she was a child, and things still obeyed rules. But these tongues did not rot. They pulsed, faintly, like hearts with no chest. The village square was unnaturally quiet when she arrived. A crowd had gathered at the chapel, a squat stone building with no steeple, no bell, and no windows. Dream's version of a holy place was more like a tomb than a church. People only went inside when something needed to be buried deeper than earth. At the door stood the bone priest. He had aged into something inhuman. His skin no longer looked like skin, more like parchment stretched too tight across a skull. His lips were still stitched shut, though one of the threads had come loose. Just one. Elna noticed it. Others did not. They were busy whispering to the elders, pointing toward her. Their eyes were filled with fear now, not the kind born of superstition, but of recognition, as if they'd begun to hear the music too. She knew what this meant. It was the same rhythm all over again. Dream always turned on those who remembered. Before they could reach her, the bone priest raised one bony hand, and the crowd obeyed. A hush even deeper than silence fell, one that Elna could feel in her ribs. Then he pointed, not at her, but to the ground beneath the chapel, and for the first time in 40 years, he moved. The villagers hesitated as he descended the steps into the earth, but Elna followed without pause. She knew what lay beneath, the old chamber of rites. It had been sealed since before she was born, and those who spoke of it did so with reverent dread. They said it was built on a foundation of teeth, and that below it, the old choir still waited. The stairwell was steep, carved from stone so old it bled moss. The deeper they went, the colder it became, not the natural cold of soil, but the stale, ancient kind, the kind that tasted of coins in the mouth and sounded like breath behind the ear. Elna held her candle close. The light flickered against the walls, revealing carvings, spirals, runes, open mouths without faces. At the bottom was a door of bone, real bone, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all fused together by black resin and sealed with 3 locks made of jawbones. The bone priest removed a tooth from around his neck, a real one, yellowed and cracked. He fit it into the first lock. It clicked. Then he pressed his stitched lips against the second lock, and the knot of thread in his mouth glowed faintly like coal catching flame. That lock opened too. The third was unlocked with a hum, a low, breathy note that didn't come from his throat. It came from beneath the floor. The door creaked open, and Elna saw the chamber. A vast hollow dome beneath the chapel, its ceiling lined with skulls turned inward, watching, listening. In the center, a massive pit, ringed by stone benches like an inverted cathedral. And in the pit, bones, thousands of them, arranged in a perfect spiral, every one of them humming. Each vertebra, each clavicle, each cracked skull. No voices, no mouths, just sound. As if the regret of the dead had calcified into vibration. The bone priest stepped into the pit, and the humming grew louder. Then Elna saw what he held, not a candle, not a relic, but a single human tongue, bound in hair, inked with old runes. It glowed faintly in his palm, pulsing like the ones in her satchel. She stepped back, her breath caught. The spiral of bones below her began to vibrate, a frequency not heard but felt. The ground shook. Then from the pit, from the thousands of bones, came a single shared voice. We were never supposed to remember. And then, but now we will make them all remember. The ground sang that night, not just in whispers or strange hums beneath the floorboards. It sang as if the earth itself had lungs, and something buried deep inside was learning how to breathe again. Elna fled the chapel chamber with the taste of ash in her mouth and her thoughts shredded by echoes. Her ears still rang with the bone priest's voice, even though he had spoken only one sentence. That was all it took. One spoken truth, loosed after 40 years of silence. And now the silence had fractured. The choir had woken. By the time she reached her home, the fog had thickened into something alive. It wrapped around her legs like wet wool and whispered things she didn't want to understand. Snatches of Chiron's voice, her mother's lullabies, the last cries of her child, words that should not still exist in the air, yet clung to it like soot. The door was open, not broken, just open. She stepped inside. The candle she had left burning was out. The salt cords on the windows had been cut, not broken, cut, clean, as if by fingers that remembered tools. And in the center of her floor, the wooden boards had been peeled back, a perfect circle, not smashed, not torn, peeled, neatly, carefully, the way you would peel the lid from a jar of something rotten you still intended to eat. Beneath the boards, The earth had been dug away, a shallow pit, damp with dark soil and flecks of red clay. And at the bottom of that pit, a row of tongues, laid in a circle, each one slowly curling and uncurling, as if trying to remember how to speak. Then came the sound. It started as a low vibration in the soles of her feet, rose through her ankles into her bones. It moved like rhythm, like breath, like heartbeat. Then it became melody. Not from the pit, from the trees. The forest outside her window stirred, though no wind moved the leaves. Branches creaked, not from motion, but from resonance. They were vibrating, straining against some invisible note. And then the children began to sing. She ran to the window and saw them, small figures, pale in the fog, scattered across the square, barefoot, dressed in night clothes, eyes closed, faces slack, but mouths open, singing. The same tune, the one Chiron used to hum, but now layered, harmonic, almost beautiful, if it didn't feel so completely wrong. Some of the villagers had come out, stumbling in half-sleep. No one dared shout. One woman tried to scream, but her mouth made no sound, as if her voice had been taken in her sleep. Another man clutched his head, blood trickling from both ears, knees buckling as he collapsed into the mud. The children continued singing, eyes still closed, voices soft, sweet, inhuman. Then Elna heard the grave open. She didn't see it, but she knew. The way a mother knows the cry of her child, the way a widow knows the weight of a final breath. Chiron's grave, the one she dug herself, the one she thought had stayed buried. Something had crawled out. Or perhaps many things had. She ran, out the door, across the square, past the weeping woman and the voiceless man and the children singing borrowed songs, into the trees, to the clearing where she had laid him. The grave was open, not dug, not destroyed, opened, carefully, like a gift being unwrapped. Inside, nothing. No body, no cloth. Only a hollow in the shape of a man once loved. And next to it, like a trail of breadcrumbs, tongues, dozens, all fresh, all glistening, laid in a spiraling path, leading back to the village. She followed them, her heart pounding. Each tongue pulsed slightly as she passed, humming faintly, each in a different voice. Some male, some female, some were children's. All were singing the same tune. A song of sorrow, of memory, of a promise broken. The last tongue in the trail lay just outside her front door, and when she stepped inside, she saw what waited beneath her floorboards. A choir of bones, dozens of skeletons, some whole, some missing parts, all of them upright in the pit beneath her home, standing shoulder to shoulder, heads tilted back. And from their rib cages, soft and slow, came the first full song. Chiron stood at the center, not a corpse, not a ghost, but something between. His eyes were hollow,
His skin was stitched tight across his face, and in his mouth, stitched into his tongue, were the tongues of others, braided together, woven like a rope of remembrance. He looked at her, and then he sang, "You let me remember. Now I will not let them forget."
They called it sleepwalking at first, but Elna knew better. This wasn't sleep. It was memory rising through small bodies like water through old stone, quiet, unstoppable, heavy with something older than dreams. By the third night, all the children in Dreham were singing. It began precisely at dusk. As the last red light curled behind the black trees, mothers would rush to close their shutters. Fathers whispered salt-bound prayers and painted sigils on door frames with ash and spit, but it didn't help, because the children would rise anyway, slowly, silently, eyes closed, faces blank. They would walk barefoot out of their beds, push open doors that had been locked, and gather together in the village square and sing. Their voices were soft at first, sweet even, innocent in tone, but chilling in form, because the melody was never theirs. It had been born from bone, not breath. And as they sang, blood would slowly trickle from their ears. Not in rivers, just a drop, just enough to remind their parents, this is not a dream, this is a summoning. Elna watched from her rooftop the next night. She didn't sleep anymore. Sleep was where the music waited, curled like a centipede behind the eyes. So she sat with her back against the chimney, lantern low, listening to the children below. There were 11 of them now. They stood in a perfect circle, bare feet on cold stone. One of them, little Sana, the baker's daughter, held something in her hands, a bird cage made of bone. Inside it, a tongue, floating, still twitching, still singing. Each child took turns holding the cage, and with each rotation, the song deepened. It was no longer just a lullaby, it became a ritual. At midnight, the bone priest appeared. He walked into the center of the circle, barefoot, silent, his lips no longer stitched. Elna tensed. She expected him to stop them, to protect them, but he did not. He knelt, bowed his head, and began to hum. The ground beneath the children cracked, not loudly, just a small fissure, a whisper in stone. But from it rose a sound Elna would never forget. It was weeping, not human, not living, a weeping made of air and memory, like every regret ever buried had been compacted into a single moan and let loose beneath their feet. The children trembled, not in fear, in recognition, as if the song was theirs now, as if they'd inherited a sorrow older than their own blood. The next morning, 3 children could not hear anymore. Their ears bled through the night. Their voices were gone. One sat catatonic by the well, fingernails torn from scratching a spiral into the stone. The healer tried to speak, but choked. He coughed up a tiny jawbone. Elna knew the village was slipping into something ancient, something not even the elders had buried deep enough. She went to the listening tree. It stood beyond the river, tall and gnarled, with bark like cracked teeth and a hollow in its center wide enough to crawl through. The oldest stories said that the first bone song had been buried here, whistled into the roots by a dying god. She pressed her ear to the bark. At first, nothing. Then a voice. They were supposed to forget, but you remembered, and now they do too. The bark split slightly beneath her cheek, and from within, a child's tongue dropped into her hands. It appeared overnight, without sound, without tools, without a single footprint in the soil. A bridge, hung between two cliffs just beyond the village, where the fog clung thicker than breath and the trees bent as if listening. A place where no bridge had ever existed before. It wasn't made of wood. It wasn't made of rope. It was made of tongues. Hundreds of them, stretched, dried, woven into sinews like twisted cords, some still wet, some petrified gray. They twisted together to form the shape of planks and rails, dangling into the abyss below like a curtain of flesh. No one dared cross it, but someone already had. They found Sana first, the baker's daughter, 7 years old, one of the first to sing. She was lying in the grass near the bridge, eyes open but unseeing. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Her tongue was gone, cleanly severed, and in its place something had been stitched in. A feather, a black crow's feather, slick with blood. She wasn't dead, but her mouth hummed without breath, softly, endlessly. A vibration born not from the throat, but from whatever had answered her song. The elders gathered, all 12. They stood in a ring at the foot of the bridge, whispering the old rites, drawing salt circles that cracked as soon as they were made. The bone priest knelt and placed a cracked jawbone on the ground. It immediately turned to ash. The bridge pulsed, not like rope swaying in the wind, like muscle. And from across the chasm, on the other side, something moved. It didn't walk, it swayed. A figure with too many joints, too long for a man, too thin for a beast, wrapped in cloth made of sewn mouths, eyes stitched shut but smiling with something that stretched the face far too wide. No sound came from it, but the tongues of the bridge began to tremble. One by one, they sang, each in a different voice, each in a language forgotten, not speaking words, but asking the question, again and again, in layers, in echoes. Who let them sing? Who remembered? Who will feed the choir? The villagers fell to their knees. Some clawed at their own ears. Others simply wept blood, unable to scream. One man crawled to the bridge and tried to sever a tongue with his teeth, begging it to stop, but it curled around his neck and dragged him into the fog. He did not scream, only hummed. Elna stood apart. She watched from the tree line, the child's tongue still in her satchel, wrapped in moss. It pulsed against her side like a second heartbeat. She knew now what the bridge was. It was not a path for them. It was a path for what was coming. A bridge made of memory, of regret, of all the words the dead were never allowed to say. And across it, from the other side, they were answering, not with forgiveness, but with music. That night, the sky above Drame opened, not with light, but with sound. A hum that split clouds, a choir that bent trees, a melody that stitched itself into bone. The bone choir had found its conductor, and the bridge was just the beginning. They called it a hymn, but it was never meant for praise, not for gods, not for peace, not for anything living. It was a sound that remembered too much, and once sung, it infected everything it touched. The sky above Dream pulsed with sound for 3 nights. Not lightning, not thunder. Vibration. The trees bent backward, not from wind, but from resonance. Glass shattered without being touched. Rivers changed direction. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, dead before they hit the ground. The children didn't sleep. They didn't blink. They sang. Each night, they gathered around the old well, hands joined, mouths open, no tongues, only the hum. Their song was spreading, and the bone hymn, that forbidden sound once buried beneath the chapel floor, was now being heard by every stone, every wall, every soul that had tried to forget. Elna no longer trusted her own voice. Even her thoughts began to rhyme with the melody. It was subtle at first, the rhythm in her footsteps, the echo of her breath. But soon she began humming in her sleep. She would wake with blood on her pillow, her jaw aching, as if something had borrowed her mouth. And each time she woke, a new tongue was waiting, laid carefully at her bedside, still warm, not hers. The elders tried to stop it. They summoned every ritual they could recall, burned sage, carved seals, even sacrificed a crow at the old altar. But the symbols twisted as soon as they were drawn. The words reversed themselves. The smoke turned black. The flame refused to light. One by one, the elders lost their hearing, not through violence. Their ears simply withered, curled inward like leaves in frost. By the dawn of the 4th day, the hymn was audible to the animals. The dogs howled in unison. The horses bit through their own tongues. A flock of blackbirds tore through the sky, circled the chapel 3 times, and then dropped, every one of them exploding mid-air as if struck by some invisible pressure. The hymn fed on memory, and Dream was full of buried things. Elna returned to the chamber beneath the chapel. She descended the same moss-carved steps, candle flickering, heart pounding. The spiral of bones had changed. The pit was deeper now, endless, echoing, as if the dead had begun to dig upward. The skulls lining the walls had turned inward again, but their mouths were open now, singing, together. The hymn rose from them like smoke, and at the center of the spiral stood Chiron. He was no longer the man she buried, nor the voice she remembered. He was something new, a conductor made of silence and bone, and every note the dead were denied. His ribcage moved with each phrase. His spine pulsed in rhythm. His tongue had braided itself into a choir of others, wrapped down his chest like a crimson sash. When he opened his mouth, it was not music that came out. It was a command. Let them all remember. Let no silence survive. Let the world weep in harmony. Elna fell to her knees. Her ears bled. Her heart beat out of sync with her body. And then, through the pain, she realized it wasn't just Dream anymore. The hymn had crossed the trees, crossed the air, crossed the threshold of the living world, and what answered from beyond the tongue bridge had begun to sing back. They found him at dawn, slumped against the outer wall of the blacksmith's home, naked, shivering, soaked in blood that wasn't entirely his. His name was Dorel, the quiet man, the scribe of Dream. He wrote death records, copied old village songs, and once carved lullabies into wooden panels for grieving mothers. Now he had carved something else, not with ink, but with his own fingernails. It was the chapel wall he'd chosen, the most sacred surface in Dream, a place never meant to hold words again. But Dorel had covered it, top to bottom, side to side, with symbols, thousands of them, ancient spirals, open mouths, tongues looped into knots, a single repeated shape that looked like a throat split open and blooming like a flower. His fingers were torn down to bone, his eyes gouged by his own hand, but the moment they found him, he laughed. "I wrote it down," he whispered. "I wrote the hymn in the blood of those who forgot." He died before they could ask what he meant. But the writing, it moved. Elna arrived just after the sun crested the trees. By then the villagers had gathered, standing in a wide circle around the chapel, refusing to approach the wall. The blood scribbles were still wet, still glistening. But what made them step back? What made one man fall to his knees and vomit his tongue onto the ground was the sound. The wall sang, softly, almost gently, a wet, vowel-heavy chant that seemed to stretch from behind the stone itself. It wasn't Dorel's voice. It was all of theirs, the voices of the forgotten, the melody written in blood. The bone priest approached first, his mouth now fully unstitched, his face gaunt and pale. He pressed his forehead to the wall and whispered a single word. The hymn paused, then resumed, but deeper, slower, as if it had heard him, as if it recognized him. Elna stepped forward next. She didn't speak. She pressed the child's tongue, still warm from the satchel, against one of the carved shapes. For a moment, it stuck to the stone like glue. Then it began to melt, absorbed into the wall, consumed like memory devoured by guilt. The wall responded. The melody shifted again, this time layered with a new voice, a child's voice, laughing, then sobbing, then singing. We were never born to be quiet. Silence is a sin we inherited. That night, the wall of the chapel glowed red. It throbbed like a wound. Villagers claimed they saw faces in the blood patterns, flickering, changing, mouths open, eyes stitched shut. Some began to kneel, not to pray, to listen. 3 people disappeared before dawn. They left no footprints, no blood, only pages, scraps of skin, flain and dried, each etched with the same thing. The notes of the bone hymn, written in a language no one had taught, but everyone now understood. By sunrise, the humming spread to the animals. The livestock refused to eat. The crows stopped flying. A fox was found sitting atop the well, its mouth wide open, howling not like a beast, but like a man in mourning. Elna knew what it meant. The hymn was writing itself now, in blood, in bone, in memory. And no matter how far you ran, if you ever remembered someone you loved, the choir would find you. They met beneath the roots of the oldest tree in Dream,
a twisted, towering thing known only as Mother Mute. No bells were rung, no horns were blown. The villagers simply knew, one by one, drawn by a dread that curled behind the ribs like rot. Those who could still walk came. Those who had not yet torn out their own tongues or collapsed under the hymn's weight. And those who still believed silence might save them. 12 of them remained, 12 who had not yet sung, 12 who still remembered how to be afraid. They gathered in the hollow of the earth where roots hung like tendrils from a sleeping beast. The soil here was cold and damp, and the air smelled of moss and old teeth. In the center, a stone basin held a pool of black water, undisturbed for centuries. This was where the first tongues were cut. This was where the oath of forgetting was born. The bone priest stood at the edge of the circle, no longer their leader, no longer their protector. Now just another one of them, shaken, aging, and full of memory he could no longer silence. He tried to speak, but no one listened. Not because they refused, but because their ears were gone. Half of those gathered had cut away their hearing with fishhooks and scissors. The rest had simply gone deaf from the hymn's pressure. They communicated now through etched signs, symbols scratched into bark, or looks filled with fear. This was the council of the voiceless, the last line before surrender. Elna stood apart from them, still hearing, still whole. But the tongues in her satchel pulsed harder each day, like they were trying to crawl back into her throat. She hadn't spoken in days, not out of fear, but because she was starting to forget what her voice sounded like. Still, they looked to her, not as leader, not as prophet, as the one who loved too much, the one who buried without cutting, the one who let the first song escape. A woman named Mirren stepped forward. She held up a shard of slate on which she had carved, "If the choir cannot be silenced, perhaps it must be completed." Gasps. Mouths opened, no sound. Elna's heart tightened. She stepped forward, her voice cracked, dry, hoarse, barely hers. "What do you mean, completed?" Mirren turned the slate over. Another message. "We stopped the dead from singing. Now they sing without us. What if we join them, willingly?" The idea spread like rot. Become part of the hymn. Let it finish. Let it take everything. Some nodded. Some fell to their knees. And Elna felt a wave of nausea deep in her gut because she understood something none of them did. This hymn had no end. It wasn't a song. It was a womb, a living rhythm growing louder with every memory unforgotten, every name whispered, every cry denied. Joining it wouldn't complete it. It would feed it. Then someone screamed. It came from above, just outside the tree hollow. A sound they hadn't heard in days. Not a song, not a moan. A child's laugh, sharp, unnatural, echoing. They all looked up, and from the cracks between the roots, blood began to pour. Not in rivers, in lines. And in those lines, shapes, notes, a message written in the blood of children. "The bone choir thanks you for remembering." No one ever asked, where did the tongues go once they're cut? For centuries, the ritual had been clear. Slice the tongue, feed it to the crow, bury the rest. No one questioned what happened afterward, as if swallowing a piece of someone's soul erased it forever. But the forest remembered, and the forest grew things back.
It began the day after the Council of the Voiceless, when the wind shifted and the trees began to whisper inward, not in words, in texture. The bark peeled itself into spirals, roots twisted into cursive, leaves fell in patterns, each one marked with tiny veined letters. Elna held one in her palm and realized it wasn't a leaf at all. It was a tongue, green, thin, still alive. It curled around her wrist like it recognized her. That morning, the graves split open, not dug, not desecrated, unzipped. From the center of each burial mound, a slender stalk grew, thin as reed, white as bone. On the end of each stalk, a tongue, not buried, not decayed, just waiting. They weren't the tongues that had been removed. They were new. And they weren't growing from the corpses. They were growing backward. Elna returned to Chiron's grave. Where she had once seen his body, there was now nothing, just soil, and a single tongue, blooming like a flower from the dirt. She bent closer. It was singing, but not a hymn, a lullaby. Her lullaby, the one she had sung to him when they were alone, when the fire crackled and the snow howled outside, and they believed the world could be soft. Tears fell from her eyes. She tried to turn away, but the tongue rose, followed her, dragged itself across the ground, humming her name in syllables too tender to belong to something so grotesque. She backed away, tripped, and then felt it, a wet slap on her spine. She turned, another tongue, then another, dozens sliding across the grass toward her, curling up trees, coiling like vines, and from behind the fog, the sound of chewing. In the village, the children were coughing, not blood, tongues, small ones, new ones. They were growing inside their throats like tumors, twisting into place where the old ones had been cut. Some choked, some screamed, some just began to speak again, but not in their voices, in the voices of the dead. Mirren was the first to be taken. She had been whispering into a jar of teeth, trying to communicate with her lost daughter. The tongue she'd buried with the child returned to her, climbed down the chimney like a slick snake, and slid down her throat. She didn't resist. She gasped in relief. Then her jaw unhinged, and she began to speak in 3 voices at once, none of them hers. By sunset, the entire forest echoed with language that had no speaker. Tongues clung to walls, dangled from trees, slid beneath doors. One child was found in his cradle, surrounded by tongues rocking him to sleep. And all across Drame, people began to remember words they had never said. Because the tongues were not simply returning, they were rebuilding memory. Backward, from the soil, from the songs, from the screams that were never allowed. Elna knew now. The ritual had never destroyed the dead's voices. It had simply postponed their return. But now the ground was fertile, and their harvest had come. Elna no longer slept above the floorboards. She couldn't. Not since they began singing underneath her. Not since the bones started to move. It began as a faint knock, soft, almost polite, as if something below her home still remembered the manners it had in life. Each night the knock became a rhythm, a pulse, a heartbeat made of wood. And then the floor began to hum. She had sealed the pit once, after the first night the bones whispered back, covered it with boards, nails, salt, prayers. It didn't matter, because the choir was patient, and it had been waiting far longer than her fear. On the 13th night, the boards lifted themselves. No force, no hands, just rose, quietly, like a curtain drawn back for the final act. Elna stood above the opening, lantern in hand, and stared down into the dark. The pit had changed. It was deeper now, wider, breathing. The bones she'd seen before, Chiron's, the others, were no longer in disarray. They stood, formed, a circle, a choir. Their jaws moved in perfect unison, but the sound they made didn't come from mouths. It came from within the marrow. The melody was low, endless, without break or breath, a sound that lived between grief and worship, vibrating through Elna's ribs, bending her knees, pressing tears from her eyes without permission. Chiron stood at the center, no longer hollow-eyed, now radiant. His skin was stitched tight, glowing faintly from the lines of old scars, each one a memory she had tried to bury. His chest was open, and inside, instead of organs, there were tongues, coiled and gently undulating like petals around a heart that still beat. He raised a hand. The choir stopped. Silence fell like dust, and then he spoke, not with sound, but directly into her blood. You feared silence, so you made me whole. But they feared memory, so they made me sing. Now I remember everything, and I am not alone. The floor behind her groaned. She turned. Mirren was there, and Wern, and the children. Their mouths were sealed, but from within their bodies the song vibrated, like insects crawling under skin, like tears swallowed instead of shed. They weren't speaking, they were resonating. Each step they took hummed a different note. Each heartbeat matched the rhythm of the choir. And Elna knew they weren't here to hurt her. They were here to bring her down, to the pit, to the choir, to the place where remembering was no longer a sin, but a sacrament. She did not run. She could not, because deep within her, beneath the layers of fear, grief, guilt, something ancient wanted to sing too. She descended the ladder into the pit of bone. The choir opened their arms. Chiron took her hand, and together they began the next verse. The silent temple had no doors. It had no roof either. It was never built to hold prayers, only echoes. They took her there at dusk. Elna walked barefoot between rows of singing bodies, each humming a different memory. Children carried candles in their mouths. Elders held cages of tongues that blinked like eyes. The bone priest led the procession, not with voice, but with vibration, his spine twisting in rhythm to an invisible metronome. Above them, the sky churned a sick red. Below them, the soil bled when stepped on. And in the far edge of the forest, the trees bent backward, roots up, branches down, as if trying to bury themselves. The world was turning inside out, and Drame was at its throat. The silent temple sat in the center of the valley, where nothing had grown for decades. Long ago, it had been a burial ground, before the ritual of tongue-cutting, before memory was outlawed. They said this was where the first song had been silenced, not with knives, but with betrayal. Elna stepped inside. There were no walls,
No altar, just a wide circle of white stone, bleached by centuries of moonlight and regret. In the center stood a raised platform of skulls fused together, each with its jaw cracked open, mouths gaping toward the sky. Above them, suspended by strings of sinew and prayer threads, floated a choir of tongues. They spun slowly, dripped blood that glowed, hummed in languages never written, only felt. Chiron waited there. He stood barefoot, shirtless, his ribs now fully open, spreading like wings. Between them, where a heart once beat, was a churning spiral of sound. Not flesh, not fire, pure memory. A black-red vortex made of whispers too heavy to carry. He did not speak to Elna this time. He sang, and every tongue in the temple turned toward him like sunflowers to light. The villagers fell to their knees. Some screamed, some wept, some simply opened their mouths and let the sound pass through them like wind through abandoned houses. Elna stepped onto the skull altar, and the blood from the floating tongues began to fall on her. Not randomly, with purpose. Each drop a story, each story a name, each name a pain she had never allowed herself to feel. The child she lost in winter, the sister who died without a proper burial, the time she screamed into her pillow instead of out loud, every kiss she gave without ever saying stay, every goodbye she swallowed to survive. Then came the final drop. It burned her skin. It was her own name, not as the villagers spoke it, as she had spoken it once as a child, before she learned to fear her own voice. Elna, whole, soft, alive. She fell, but not in pain, in release. The bone choir sang louder, and for the first time the earth sang back. The valley cracked, the fog parted, tongues bloomed across the mountains, and somewhere beyond Drame, in distant villages where no one remembered the old rites, people awoke humming songs they'd never learned. The silent temple glowed blood red, and the choir was no longer trapped beneath the floor. It was everywhere now.
There was something older than Drame, older than the bone choir, older than even the silence that birthed them. It lived beneath the hills, where stone teeth jutted from the ground like a cracked jawbone and the air vibrated without wind. The villagers called it the mouth that was never closed, because no matter how deep they buried their dead, something still listened. Elna woke in its shadow. She was lying on her back atop a bed of moss, her body trembling with song. The blood from the silent temple still clung to her skin like wet scripture. But now it was dry. Now it was etched in, a language beneath her pores. She no longer needed to speak. She was the hymn. Around her, the valley lay broken. Drame had split open like a cracked rib cage, its buildings half swallowed by the earth, its trees humming like tuning forks, their roots writhing with tongues that had grown into tendrils. People no longer moved like people. They moved in chords. Families marched in harmonic dissonance, each step echoing a verse of the bone hymn. Children crawled across ceilings. Elders hummed in their sleep and bled from their eyes in joy. The choir was no longer singing for attention. It was singing to awaken something. The voice. It had always been there, buried deep beneath the chapel, beneath the roots, beneath the rules. The elders didn't worship it. They feared it. That's why they started cutting tongues. That's why they fed crows instead of memory.
because if enough voices remembered at once, it would speak back. And now it was answering, from beneath the stone teeth. Elna felt it in her bones before she saw it, a pulse, not just in rhythm, but in recognition. Something knew her name, not the one her parents gave her, not the one Chiron whispered, the original one, the one she had forgotten the moment she was taught to keep quiet. She stood before the cracked stones, where a black crevice had opened like a yawn. Inside, a tunnel pulsed with red light, dim, wet, breathing. From the walls, tongues grew like vines. They pulsed when she walked by, whispered things, begged her to sing them into wholeness. And then she heard it, the voice. Not music, not human, but felt. A vibration so deep it made her teeth ache, her stomach twist, her heart slow. You buried me in silence, but I drank every memory, and now I am full. It didn't come from one direction. It came from inside her skull. She stepped deeper. The walls of the cave tightened around her, bones embedded in the stone like fossils of forgotten grief. Skulls whispered as she passed. Some had names, some had none, but every one had once belonged to someone who had tried to forget and failed. At the end of the tunnel was a mouth. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, a mouth. Massive, cracked open in the earth, lined with ancient teeth. Its tongue was the forest, its breath was the wind, its saliva the fog that rolled through Drame. This was where the bone choir had always led, to the first voice, the original sorrow, the echo of the world's first forgotten name. And Elna stepped forward. She did not flinch. She did not pray. She opened her mouth and sang. It was not a song meant for human throats. The notes were too old, too deep, carved from the grief of civilizations that had vanished without names, whose ruins still wept beneath deserts and oceans. But Elna sang it anyway, because it was already inside her. As her voice rose, the mouth beneath the stone teeth shuddered. Its gums pulsed, its breath thickened. Tongues slithered from the cave walls, curling like roots toward her ankles, not to restrain her, but to listen. They pressed against her skin, her ribs, her neck, desperate to be close to the source of the sound that should not have returned. And still, she sang. Each note peeled away a layer of the world. The sky above Drame cracked, not with thunder, but with voices long buried. Clouds wept not water, but whispers. Hills vibrated with the bones of forgotten grandmothers. Rivers reversed their flow, gurgling songs of drowned children. The bone choir sang with her. Chiron, the bone priest, the tongueless children, the trees, the air, all joined the hymn. And still, it was not enough, because this song had no ending. It was built from unfinished goodbyes. Elna felt her body begin to change. Her ribs opened, painlessly, reverently. Her tongue split, then reformed into something longer, broader, shared, not just hers. The tongues of every word she never spoke, every scream she swallowed, every name she lost. Her lungs filled with memories, not breath, memories, of those she loved, of those she failed, of every lullaby she forgot to hum. And as she held the final note, the mouth shivered and spoke back. You remembered. You dared to sing what they buried. Now you will never forget again. The mouth began to close, slowly, lovingly, not to crush her, to keep her. Because every choir needs a heart, every song needs a center, and Elna had become it. Above ground, the villagers fell to their knees. They felt it, the shift, not an ending, not salvation, a new rhythm, something permanent. The bone choir didn't fade, it settled, it rooted. It became the background hum of the world, like wind, like heartbeat, like guilt. And far away, beyond the valley, beyond the hills, in cities that never heard of Drame, children began to hum, a tune they couldn't name. But it made their mothers cry, and their grandfathers sit very still, and the old priests pause in fear, because memory had returned, because silence had failed, because the song would never end.
They came with the fog, not through doors, not through roads, but through cracks in remembering. No one saw their arrival, only felt what followed. Gaps, emptiness, names that used to have weight suddenly gone. A boy in Dream woke up and no longer recognized his sister. A widow looked at a grave she had dug with her own hands and whispered, confused, who was buried here? A mother found her baby humming the bone hymn in a voice that was not his and couldn't remember ever giving birth. They were called the Memory Eaters. Not monsters, not ghosts, just hollows. Shadows shaped like people who never finished grieving. They had no eyes, but they found you through your sorrow. No feet, but they followed you through your guilt. No mouths, because they borrowed yours. You'd know they'd fed on you when a song you loved turned into static, or a name you once whispered tasted like ash. Elna, or what remained of her, watched from beneath the earth. She was no longer flesh, she was rhythm, she was pulse, she was the root note of the bone choir's new verse. But even she felt them arrive. The Memory Eaters did not sing. They consumed song, not to destroy it, but to reshape it. And when they entered the valley, the choir paused. For the first time since the mouth had spoken, the hymn trembled, like a candle touched by wind. The bones beneath Dream shifted, the tongues curled inward. Even Chiron, eternal conductor, took a step back. Because these creatures weren't outsiders, they were consequences. One approached the chapel ruins. Its form flickered like wet cloth hung in fog. It didn't move. It unhappened. The moment it stepped where the altar once stood, the ground beneath it forgot being stone. It crumbled into mud made of memory. The choir resisted. A new melody rose, sharp, discordant, defiant. Elna poured herself into it. She summoned every forgotten kiss, every stifled scream, every lullaby buried beneath survival. And the valley roared, a wall of sound ancient and aching. For a heartbeat, the Memory Eaters recoiled. But then they sang back, not with beauty, not with sorrow, but with blankness. A melody without melody, a rhythm with no pulse, a chorus of silence so absolute it erased itself as it was heard. Where their note passed, graves forgot they were graves, trees forgot they had roots,
Children forgot what it meant to fear. And one by one, the voices of the bone choir began to flicker. Not die, just dim. Elna screamed, not aloud, but through the marrow of the valley. They are taking everything. But even she felt it, a crack inside her, a forgotten face she could no longer recall, a pain she once cherished, now just noise. The memory eaters were not evil, they were balance. Where memory grows too loud, they come to quiet it. Where songs are made of scars, they arrive to make the wound smooth again. And Dream had sung too long.
They came to silence the song, to swallow memory, to unwrite every sorrow that had dared to speak. But they had underestimated one thing: the hunger of grief, the defiance of a wound kept open too long. Because Drom had not merely remembered, it had been rebuilt by remembering. And some wounds, once sung into the soil, refused to close. The memory eaters spread like fog. Where they passed, melody collapsed. The spiral of bones beneath Elna's house turned to dust. The tongues hanging from the trees shriveled into silence. Even the floating voices of children began to hiccup, stutter, then fade. The choir dimmed, but it did not die. Because some of the villagers still clung to their pain. They held it like a sacred object, like a prayer too dangerous to say aloud. And pain, when held close, becomes a voice all its own. Elna stirred beneath the earth, not with limbs, but with vibration. She had become the song's spine, the marrow of its defiance. And now that marrow cracked, splitting into a million threads, each one reaching toward a single idea. Do not forget. Cheiron felt her call. He stepped into the center of the old silent temple, now just a crater of ash, and opened his ribs. Inside, the spiral of tongues still beat, barely. He reached inside and pulled out a single fragment, Elna's first memory. He lifted it to his mouth and whispered it aloud. Your name was Elna. You were 5. Your mother braided your hair while humming a song with no words, and you felt safe. The memory eaters paused. For the first time since they arrived, they hesitated, because it was not grief, not suffering, not agony that resisted them. It was tenderness remembered. And then all across Drom, the others joined in, not with screams, not with rage, but with fragments, a broken lullaby, a final dance in the kitchen, a forgotten pet's name whispered into sleep. Each memory, when spoken, lit like a match in the fog, and the choir rose again. Not as a roar, but as a hush full of meaning. Like a hand on the shoulder, a hum against the chest, a sigh that becomes a song. The choir did not scream back, it remembered back. And the memory eaters felt it. For the first time, they trembled. Their forms flickered. Their silence cracked. A low moan escaped their blank mouths, something like confusion.
because they had always fed on grief. But what if the song had grown past grief? What if the pain had found a voice too complex to consume? And Elna sang again. From beneath the earth, from the cracks in bone, from inside the teeth of the valley itself, not as a warning, but as a vow. We will hurt, we will lose, but we will not forget. And as long as we remember, the song will never end. The memory eaters began to fall apart, one by one, name by name, not destroyed, but changed. Their silence became stillness. Their hunger became listening. Their forms collapsed into the dirt like mist returning to the well, and in their place flowers began to bloom, white, petalless, shaped like open mouths, and from them the bone choir sang, not in agony, but in acceptance.
Drame did not go quiet, not after the memory eaters dissolved, not after the fog lifted, not even after the last tongue stopped twitching, because the song had changed. It no longer wept, it remembered. The ground no longer shook, the sky no longer bled, but the stones hummed softly beneath bare feet, and the trees still leaned slightly toward one another, as if whispering secrets from long ago. The bone choir did not fade. It simply settled into everything. Elna now lived in all corners of the valley, in the whisper of kettle steam, in the rustle of leaves before dusk, in the way lullabies returned to the lips of those who once forgot how to sing. She was not a ghost. She was the final verse, and her name was no longer forbidden. It was spoken with warmth, with weight, with the quiet ache that lives between "I miss you" and "thank you." The villagers changed. No more rituals of mutilation. No more feeding tongues to crows. Instead, when someone died, they were laid beneath the listening tree. Not in silence, but in story. Their names spoken aloud. Their joys recited like poems. Their regrets whispered gently into the wind. And then, one voice, always one, would sing, "Let them be remembered, not for their silence, but for the song they left behind." Children no longer feared their dreams. They welcomed the soft voices that came to them in the dark, whispers not of warning, but of guidance, of belonging, of grief that no longer needed to be buried. Chiron was last seen standing in the chapel ruins, his ribs no longer open, his chest full again, not with organs, but with sound. He turned to the horizon, eyes closed, lips parted, and as the wind passed through him, he vanished. Not gone, just dispersed, the way songs do when the last note is allowed to breathe. The bone choir did not end, because sorrow never ends, but it found harmony. It became part of the world, not a wound, but a thread woven through every loss, every goodbye, every soft, trembling memory that we dare to hold. And in the deepest roots beneath Drame, where once a mouth had opened in hunger, there was now only stillness. And beneath that stillness, a heartbeat, slow, steady, whole. She came from far beyond Dream, not following a map, not chasing a myth, just running. From a silence that felt too loud, from a world that taught her grief should be hidden and memory should never ask for too much space. She didn't know the name of the valley, didn't know its history, didn't know that the air carried lullabies once soaked in blood. But when her boots touched its soil, she heard it. A hum, low, steady, familiar. The villagers watched her quietly. They no longer feared outsiders, because grief is universal. Because anyone who walks into dream with a haunted gaze is already family. They did not ask why she came, only if she was ready to remember. She didn't answer. But that night, she sat beneath the listening tree, and when the wind shifted just slightly, she began to cry. Not with panic, not with shame, but like someone who had just heard her own name whispered for the first time in years. She stayed, swept floors, lit candles, sat by the graves even though she didn't know the names carved into the stones. And every dusk, she returned to the listening tree, not to pray, to listen. One evening, as the last gold faded from the sky, she opened her mouth, and without knowing how, she began to sing. It wasn't a song she'd learned. No lyrics, no structure, just feeling. A melody born from every goodbye she never got to say, every photo she stopped looking at, every word she swallowed when someone said, "You're still not over it?" The song rose from her chest like smoke from a long extinguished fire. And when it filled the air, the bone choir answered. Not in voices, not in harmony, but in remembrance. The ground hummed, the trees bowed, the sky held its breath. And in that moment, she became part of the story. Not the beginning, not the end, but the one who proved, so long as there is pain, so long as someone dares to remember, the song will never die. And far below the valley, where Elna still breathed within the soil, where Chiron's name was still sung in the rustle of the pine, a tiny sound echoed upward, a whisper, a note, a seed, growing toward the next voice brave enough to sing.